I would like to welcome everybody to our first workshop for Piton Noire. And I chose today's topic about voice and dialect because of a couple of things that came up in our panel discussion about writing and science fiction and how to create a sense of space and place. And Sharon had a question actually about the use of dialect in her writing. And I didn't feel 100% qualified to speak on that, partly because I am a white male who speaks the dominant dialect. So that is not something that I have had to navigate. For a little bit of context, I did my master's with a intersectional feminist lens about how visible minority immigrants integrate into the French language community in Manitoba. So I know enough to know that I don't know enough. So I thought that it would be useful for us to invite somebody who could speak on that a bit more eloquently and more fully. So I invited my sister, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Ottawa, and she studies minority voices and really has gone in depth on how to navigate how one speaks and how one speaks in light of a colonial majority. So I thought that was very relevant for writers from Dominica, especially in the diaspora, because those issues are very present in how we present ourselves and how you present your home culture. So I will hand it off to Franchesca to start leading us in our discussion.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so as Chris said, my name is Franchesca. You can call me Fran or Franny. It's not, Franchesca sounds really stuffy sometimes. I am Anishinaabe from Winnipeg. My grandmother was from Saging. Chris and I grew up in like a very diverse family, I guess. I don't like using the word diverse, but yeah, so I'm indigenous. I was raised by our parents through foster care. And so, yeah, as a young adult, I started learning more about my community and my culture because foster care is this government process that's about eliminating culture and disconnecting folks from their communities in many ways, as it is about extracting children from unsafe environments. There are ripple effects to what happens within that process. And when I was raised by Newfies, so that is the culture that I ended up getting raised with. I'm super fond of red rose tea and lard biscuits and have a weird accent now. So it's complicated, I guess, is the moral of that story. But yeah, I ended up going into art and wanted to be an artist, and I did an undergrad in ceramics and was really drawn to these conversations around community and coming together, and also how within ceramics there are hierarchies built in what high art is, and then craft, and also just what was inherent to the conversations, which was you're making things for people to interact with in their day-to-day. So when you make a bowl, you are making something that someone touches and eats out of, and when you make a cup, you're making something that they put their lips on, and that's really intimate. And so for a really long time, I've been thinking about audience, and I've been thinking about how I connect with other people, which is a really little sad little orphan thing, right? You know, wanting to find connections and relationships in ways that are safe for me. And so yeah, I went into craft, and then I started curating because I really loved being excited by the art and by the ideas that artists were making. And I have this weird ability to speak to institutions and get them to do what I want. So that ended up being really handy in communicating. And so, yeah, I just kind of fell into curating, and curating is where you select art to go on a wall and you write the ideas of an exhibition. And so you create like a rationale or an explanation of like why a certain art project is important. Usually you start by like writing an explanation to a granting body and being like, please give us money. Our idea is better than everyone else's. And then that's usually to other artists who juries are made up of peers. And then you write to another audience, which is a gallery, to be like, hey, please take this exhibition. We got money for it. And this is why this suits your gallery or your mandate, or this is why it changes the art landscape. And so that's like another audience where you have to talk more technically. You have to think like really big picture. And then finally, when you start writing for when the show goes up, you're speaking to like an art history and a like ongoing discussion so that there's relevance with like what you're doing on like the art side, but you're also creating and writing labels or ideas for individuals who are like entering this art space. And every art space is different. And so if you're writing for an artist run space that's edgy, you can use like fancy words and be really like aggressive in a way that I really, really, really enjoy. Before we started recording, we were talking about the art scene in Ottawa being a little like vanilla. And because it's owned by a bunch of it's a lot of federal institutions, whereas artist-run spaces are where like those pushes are happening, and that's where the arts community gets its rep for being like on the fore. But it's definitely not in federal institutions. So my last large gig was at the National Gallery of Canada, and so how I wrote for them, I would send my stuff out to the editors and they'd be like, no, you cannot say this. You cannot put this on our wall. And so like, how do you create counter narratives in these like large institutional spaces with like having to like jump over hoops or jump over barriers that are like white editors, white unsympathetic editors. So, or like, how do you communicate to them that like what they're asking of you and what they're asking for you to do is actually like another form of colonization. So it's really tricky to like navigate and also to maintain those relationships, because like you also will have to work with these people for the rest of your life. So it's a lot of like, it's a balancing act. So that's my personal relationship with writing as a curator, as a cultural producer. And Chris talked a little bit about what the previous discussion had been, and I got very excited because we just call and catch up sometimes, and it's really something that I've been thinking about. And within like an Indigenous perspective, or like within a community-based perspective, I will tell you about my family, I will tell you about my background. I'll also tell you about like where our interests will intersect, and then open up space for us to find that together. And I know like there's always like intended outcomes, but I also have like a really dialogical way of functioning. It's a little bit harder in Zooms because it's not as natural, and it's harder to like read people's body language for when they like, you can see when people have ideas and when they're like ready to go. And so it's really the technological aspect of how do we generate these spaces in COVID, but we don't need to go down that rabbit hole. But I would like to get some like robust introductions from everybody else if it's possible. I see Roy is back, and I hope the audio is working better now, but I'll quickly type something in the chat while I listen, because I also don't know what everybody has written in the book, or where everybody's located. So I'm living on unceded Algonquin territory here in Ottawa. And I come from Treaty 1. So lots of strong Métis niche representation in the places that I've lived and worked. And a lot of like pride in that also. And just really wanting to live up to those expectations. So anyways, I will just tap someone. And then if you can like tag another person, it just like prevents the awkward lull in between intros. So would you like to go share it?
Sure. Originally, I'm from Dominica, and is in the Caribbean, and I now live in Alberta. Prior to Alberta, I live in Toronto, which we know is multicultural. So I get to have a lot of fun and to interact. Here in Alberta, it's slightly different. We don't see much of this culture unless we go to Edmonton. I do write a lot, a variety of writing, poetry, short stories, a little bit of my history. That's what I like to do. And I'm interested in talking about dialect because I have interjected some of that in my work. I've seen some from my other counterpart writers like Gifters John, and I think a little bit from Nicole herself. And we want to know, how does it impact? Because in my last story, which was published with Prison Press, they have told me to take off some of that because they couldn't understand the language. So I want to know from you, like, why is that? Because like, why can't I just speak how I talk? How I speak? And like, what is the coincidence of that? And like, I think Roy is trying to comment. Other than that, I have a wife, mother, 3 children, and writing is my hobby. Just something I do on the side before I make a little extra cash, and I want to learn as much as I can from there. I can't remember what treaty I am. It was Treaty 6. I don't remember.
Yeah, it is Treaty 6. I worked at the Art Gallery of Alberta, and so we actually did an entire exhibition called Borderlines, and it was about it rather being located provincially, it was located through the treaties, and now I have.
My only question is that my side plight though, when I come in contact with other Métis and Indians, the loss of language. It's really sad. Like some of them are crying because they cannot remember because it was mixed, like our language. We now speak Creole in Dominica, and it's like similar to you guys, like it's all mixed with French. And I want to know how you feel about that. Thank you.
Okay, I wasn't tagged, but I guess I'll just go ahead. So I'm going to invite Roy to just write his intro into the chat room, and then perhaps one of us can read it for him. But my name is Nicole Georges Bennett. I'm also originally from Dominica, been living in Toronto for about, 25 years plus. I met Chris at University of Ryerson, where we both did broadcast journalism. And I think for me, the path to finding my own voice has been very much wrapped in the colonial background that we come from as Caribbean people. So it is probably only, I would say, in the last maybe 10 years or so that I've seriously started to think about the implications of that, more so because I'm kind of getting into writing, and I'm writing in genres that are not traditionally well represented when it comes to minorities, so, which is science fiction and fantasy. And I also have experienced what Sharon describes when you try to shop your work to traditional publishers, and their response is, can you explain a little bit more or provide some context, but yeah, the reader isn't going to be able to follow what you're saying here. So you have a whole manuscript that's just thrown out, because they don't want to take the time to learn, or to have you perhaps, or to help you to explain in more detail or with more context what your story is about. So I'm also very excited, Franchesca, to meet you and to have you here to speak to us about these topics. Sharon's got a ton of questions, as you can tell already. So I'll just wrap up here at this point.
Well, we have another human who's joined. Do you
Roy?
want to introduce?
Oh, Erwin.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
Erwin, you need to turn on your cam and your audio. Hopefully, we may, because people are joining us from the island, we will probably have some challenges internet-wise. So I'm hopeful that they will utilize the chat room so they can be part of the discussion.
I see. Hi.
Hi, good day, everyone.
Hi, Erwin.
We just did some intros, and so would you like to intro? Hi, Erwin. I'm Fran. I'm Krista's sister. I write about Indigenous art, and I curate. And yeah, I'm really excited to chat with everybody. I was wondering if you would be interested in introducing yourself, and then I will share a document. Yeah.
My name is Erwin Mitchell. I'm from Dominica. I'm a firefighter by profession. I'm on duty right now, as you can see. So just taking the opportunity, to be part of the event. I mainly write poetry. I also do short stories and motivational quotes. I am a member of Whitey Kubuli Writers Association and Piton Noire, which I was recently introduced. So that's about it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for your time. If Roy, when Roy writes this, I will happily pause and read it out loud. So one of the things that I wanted to start with was, thinking a little bit about what colonialism is, and because that's such a big part of my work, and differentiating the words that we use, which is decolonization and indigenization. And so within specifically a framework that, when I talk about my Indigenous experience, I'm talking about an Indigenous experience in Canada, growing up in a government system. But there are also other terms of Indigenous experience that talk about a global Indigenous experience that would also apply to folks who are Indigenous to Dominica, and like what kind of interactions or the impacts that colonialism has on the day-to-day. I'm obviously not as familiar with that. I'm quite specialized in North America, but I think like those are really important and lovely things to think about.
Sorry, Fran, I'm sorry, may I interject?
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I don't want to preempt Roy, but I just think that you will be even more interested in what he has to say if we can get him involved, because he comes from the indigenous peoples of Dominica, who are called the Kalinagos. So they are the native Indians of Dominica. And so he is, I guess you could say, a representative for them in this discussion. So it would be really wonderful if we can get him involved.
Yeah. Oh, that'll be really cool. Yeah. Yes, please write your intro, Roy. So thinking about that, but also how colonial experiences, a lot of like the reading that I've done has been like by Césaire and Frantz Fanon. And so like this intersection or this interweaving of colonial experience on Black bodies is really, it's a shared space. It's not the same space, but it's a shared space. And so thinking about Queen's English as a colonial space, and also thinking about publishing and editing as a space that's meant and entrenched within white supremacy,
Mm.
right? So this idea of centering a white audience rather than teasing out the nuances of communities and cultures. And I would argue a little bit with Chris's quote in that there is a dominant culture.
Mhm.
I do like the fact that the quote identifies that it is a culture, because I do run across people who are like, I should be able to like wear headdresses and stuff because I don't have a culture. You're so lucky. But there's also these theories around otherness where things have to be, there are parts of indigenous culture, or specifically within my community, Anishinaabe culture, that were not different enough to be exotic. And so those are things that have been cast aside. And then things like Sundance or like male dominant patriarchal practices built into like the myth of the warrior, very appealing to white Victorian men who were anthropologists, but also not the entire picture of what my community was, right? And so I think thinking about how those things have seeped into all of these structures, like galleries are horrible for it. When I did my intro and I was talking about having 3 different conversations and thinking about 3 different audiences, to think about audience or tone or who I'm talking to, and then writing something different for each stage. So when I'm writing to artists and I'm getting them money, I feel like I have a more empathetic audience, but I have to explain things still. And there's like low-key threats also in my grants. It's like, this is a great thing and this will decolonize. And if you don't, you're kind of racist. Like there's just like this undertone of like, this is why it's important and this is why you should care. And telling people that. And then the galleries, it's like, this is how it will make you look good. And so like when you're writing something for editors or pitching things for editors, I think there's like, you're appealing to a person and it might not be your final product. And so that's how I navigate those issues, is I have different voices, and usually I wait until it's too late to like cancel whatever I'm writing, that I like insert something either really feisty. So when I worked for the Art Gallery of Alberta, I wrote about how bad the oil patch was in a couple different essays. And we got a lot of oil money. And I did get into some trouble every once in a while for it. But it was always too late. Like it couldn't be changed. And so there are really sneaky ways that I would operate to make sure that what I wanted to get in there would get in there. And so I used timelines and things like that as a way to get what I wanted. It's also just easier to work with people that are on the same page as you. It's just a lot less energy on your end. It's a lot of emotional energy. And it's really hard to write something and then have to write something and feel good and feel like you've put a little piece of your heart into it, and then to have someone ask you why it's important. Like that, just like that moment of like real vulnerability. But okay, I'll share my document with you and I'll show you some of the suggested changes. This is a catalog essay for an artist, Lori Blondeau, who is doing a survey exhibition in Winnipeg right now. It's super overdue. But she shared a lot of stories with me over the years. And I've been really lucky yeah, to work with her. And where the heck are you? Okay, 1 second. It's because I had to open other tabs. 1 second. Oh, this is like the most awkward part of all. There we go. Every Zoom ever. Okay, so this is the document, and these are the suggested edits. Again, I had 2 editors. One is my partner, Tom McLeod, and my other editor is Nicole Burish. And so Tom works for a magazine with ITS, ITK. He's in the other room. He's probably like, you don't know where I work and you're talking about me in the Zoom. Anyways, and then the other editor was Nicole Burish, who is a settler woman who works at the National Gallery, super great ally, super amazing human, and really on it, but like also functions within this Western European understanding of what writing is and what those conventions are. And so I will just quickly show you how I want it formatted, because this is also another strategy for circumventing some of the ideas. So we were talking about dialect and how do we integrate dialect into writing. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Pardon me, I had bubble tea earlier. How do we integrate dialect into our writing? But how we can also integrate different formatting. So the stories, there are narratives interspersed within the writing, and they are disembodied from time and place and individuals. So through decontextualizing them, they become accessible. And that is a strategy within storytelling, so that it becomes less about whether or not it's true or not, because we can sometimes get wrapped up in like, is this real? Is this autobiographical? Is this, but it's really about the ideas or the lessons. Mm-hmm. And really treating stories as metaphor and spaces where you can jump off. And so by decontextualizing them, you resist this Western European understanding of quantifying something or yeah, essentially just, is it real or not, and locating it. And so you'll see in the red, when I was like writing to my editors, like I wasn't very confident about the section. But the sections that are in red will be in circles. And so they're disconnected from the text, and from the text that's very strongly my voice and speaking from my position and speaking about my relationship. So there's also this disembodiment of the author that happens, specifically also with art writing. You talk with an authoritative voice. And I really like to locate my writing within my own voice and my own experience. If you put like all of my essays together and picked out the parts where I talk about what my relationship is, you could probably like put together a pretty good narrative of like how I grew up and like the identity stuff I've worked through. So I share a lot in my writing, and I'm happy to do it. It's also just very scary and uncomfortable the first couple of times. And I think I'll point out this specifically around dialect and language language revitalization within Anishinaabe community. Last year, I curated a symposium called Zigaminishin Winnipeg 2020. So like spilling beads, spreading beads, spilling seeds. Like there's different iterations of what it means as an event. And I promised myself, because it's really like popular in Indigenous art right now, or in art communities, to use language to name things. And to act like as an intellectual framework. But, and this is like a standard I hold myself to, not others. But I didn't want to use language within my curatorial practice until I actually learned language, or started to learn, or like started doing that work. Because it's easy to put words in that don't mean anything without knowing what they mean, if that makes any sense. So yeah, like it would be like somebody integrating a dialogue who's just like throwing in slang, and it's just really artificial. And if you're from that community, you're like, I see what you're doing. Like you're kind of, but there are actual like phrases that are really a part of community. So there's the word Minjimuyi, and that's like grandmother, and I pronounce that really badly. But like I also wrote when he was razzed about it. Razzed is like a word that we do use in Winnipeg, and that feels really close to my home. And like people stumbled over that. They're like, that's a weird word. I'm like, it's home, right? And so there are things slipped into there that aren't as exotic as saying like old woman in Anishinaabe. I also don't define it, right? It's just the word for old woman. If someone wants to know it, they can Google it. I accidentally wrote grandfather the first time. That was a mistake. And it's also really difficult, or like not difficult, but it's not natural to use the word grandmother as like as a thing. It's either my grandmother or your grandmother. Those are the contexts in which like I've learned grandmother, the word grandmother. And so to it doesn't work grammatically to say noko, because it's not, I'm not writing to Lori. I'm also not writing about my own grandmother. And so I don't know, I didn't know the word. I looked it up, like for grandmother as an individual, as a separate, alone word. But like old woman makes more sense. And I know like in a lot of communities, or like specifically, like if I called my mother old woman, she would flip on me. She would be so mad. But like even the word in community, like the old people, right? Like it's you don't actually use the word elder for everybody who's old, right? It's a really specific. And so how do you claw back? Because I anticipate getting pushback from the gallery, them being like, well, we don't know this word. Why don't you just say elder? And no, she's not an elder. And so there's a lot of power in refusal in the ways that like I function with spaces. But I also come from like a place of privilege where I've worked at a federal institution, and there are not a lot of Indigenous writers in the prairies that have the time to hash out catalogs, and especially after I got into a PhD, like the offers for writing really came in. So thinking about privilege is also like the right of refusal comes with privilege, and being like a white passing indigenous woman, right? So that might not be super duper helpful. Just say no. You're welcome. End of discussion. That's not a, it's a nice strategy when you have the ability to do it. But, and then there's another quote that I wanted to highlight. So when I talked about decontextualizing, so decontextualizing space, I located the theater in the Exchange District. I wanted to recognize the institution that invited Lori to speak, because I think that was really important, that folks who are like doing that work and who are doing that community building get recognized, and who are inviting indigenous artists before it's cool to do it. So like there's all of these like micro decisions that go into like what information is included, that I'm not always super comfortable sharing with other art spaces. But Nicole really wanted me to add more details. So like capitalize Exchange District, say like what year it's in, and add more information. So this like, again, Western European urge to quantify or like make something real. Like if you wanted to know which talk I was talking about, you could Google Art Space 2018, November 3rd, and find it. Because I had to go and I had to, like, I wanted to make sure that I got the time right. I actually thought it was in the middle of the winter, and it was not, so I had to change it to fall. But like, would it have mattered if I had written it that it had happened in winter or in fall? Like, was that the important thing? I just remember being cold walking there. And that's what I wanted to convey. Like the blusteriness and the warmness, like entering into the space. And so I think the parsing out like what is important and why, so that when you are, if you are confronted by an editor, you can say, this is why this is important to me. Because I talked to Nicole and I was like, I'm actually taking out a lot of this information now because I was riding in the middle and I wasn't actually, I was trying to do both things. I was trying to be like quantifiable, but also like follow the storytelling like process and priming people for what was going to happen further down. Be like, this isn't a normal piece of art writing. I'm not going to tell you about the formless qualities of the artworks. And I'm probably not, I honestly don't even really talk about what the artwork looks like, right? So how does that push back? Every time that I go through an iteration of writing or communication with like a different body, I think about it as like stretching and pushing people a little bit further. Because I have the energy for that. Not everybody does. So that's also, I'm not sure if Chris has mentioned this before, but I have endless energy for arguments. So, you know, definitely the favorite sibling. But yeah, I think those were really key moments. And then there was another example within the writing where I talk about myself. I'm so sorry. He's a very loud talker and he is in another room with the door closed and I can still hear him. The the section where I talk about this sentence, as an individual who had been taken out of community, I don't have the same access, knowing, or memory of place. And so one of the suggestions from Nicole had been, I had been removed from community. And so like the nuance between taken and removed are two different words. And thinking about where it puts the power and where it also puts my agency. So if when you're writing and you're using dialect or your own voice, like in a lot of ways, that's really, really, really empowering. And so what does it mean to concede? So like, this isn't grammatically accurate, like good at all. This is a terribly written sentence by like all textbook. But the word taken is way more important than being right. And using that action or that word. And so this is where if using a word in dialect or using having a conversation is more important than being like grammatically correct, then there are really good ways to argue that or to prioritize that. But anyways, so yeah, these were the tips that I had last week with some of my writing. And I think some of the questions that I hope touched on some of the questions that folks had asked. Why can't I write the way that I speak? I don't think there's any reason for you not to. This is going to a gallery audience, right? This is going to an audience of humans who are going to be moving through this space to look at Lori's work. And so when someone picks up a catalog to read about an Indigenous artist's work, they should be ready and willing to engage with Indigenous culture and Indigenous ideas and Indigenous language, and do it in a way that's humble, and it isn't about them. This isn't about you. This is about me writing and talking about my relationship with Lori. I don't talk about Lori Blondeau. In art writing, you would call her Blondeau throughout the whole essay. But that's not my relationship with her, and I don't want it to be like that. So I call her Lori, and I call her Mom Leona. Like, I'm prioritizing what's important to me. And that's, again, like from a place of privilege, but that's why I want to write about art. I don't think that if I had to actually hack and slash this essay to make it fit these conventions, it wouldn't look anything like it wouldn't convey anything that I want it to convey, and I wouldn't want it to see the light of day. I would rather not get paid, not be published, and then make a stink about it on social media and make everybody suffer. Like, I wouldn't. So I think like that's really, there's another, I would stop talking. I go on a rant actually about this in halfway through the essay, where the emphasis on the Western gaze and writing that focuses, sorry, I'll highlight this, writing that focuses on how Indigenous cultural production that benefits the Western gaze has effectively overshadowed the ways in which artists have made and continue to make work that centers themselves, their families, and their communities. I don't care about the white people who are coming to my shows. I appreciate that they're there and that they're doing the work, but I'm also not going to cater to them. I want to speak to my communities. I want to speak to other like young indigenous people who might not be living in their communities or might be being raised by white folks too, and see an artwork and feel seen, right? There's this really powerful, and that's the whole point of having like a variety of experiences and having cultural producers who come from different spaces and lived experiences. I should have asked him first. My partner told me a story about when he read this passage that was about getting dressed and picking an outfit, and how he was presenting himself as like a large indigenous man who moves through the world, and how people find him really threatening. He's like 6'5". I'm not bragging about him right now, maybe a tiny bit, but he's 6'5". He's like this Inuk man, and he walks through the world where people think he's scary, and he's like the softest, gentlest human ever. And the way that he dresses and the way that he presents himself is always to make himself seem like less intimidating and less scary. And so the amount of time that he spends getting dressed and prepared for the day is like way longer than me. I'm like, I am femme, I am presenting as femme, I am wearing flowers today. Which flowers will I wear? So for him to feel seen in a book about someone choosing an outfit while thinking about these things was a really important moment for him. And for us to write and for us to create cultural production, we have those powers, and I think they're really wonderful and important for that. So I guess like, well, maybe that's like personal. I'll stop sharing now. Sharing the screen, I'll continue talking obviously. But yeah, I guess like, are there passages or sections that you've written that you were like, you wish you had read in the past, or that like you really felt like you put your heart out on it? So I'm kind of curious about, or are there any questions? I guess I should ask that first before I keep rambling.
Yeah, Sharon had actually asked you, I think, probably about 3 questions in quick succession. And I think you've touched on some of them. But Sharon, do you recall what you asked her at the top of the hour?
She did answer what I asked about how she feel about the culture, and why is it that when I project my work with my dialogue, why is it rejected? And I don't think it's fair. Like, I think I want to see more, as she say, about the community. I'm writing for my community. They're looking for that. Even when I'm looking for work, I'm looking for work from my community. And to read from what the Europeans have projected to me or have provided for me, like, I don't think it's fair. And I'm happy that you touched that. Like, how can we go forward? Like, I know you said it's okay to say no, but it was very tough to say no, because they sent it back. They sent my work 3 times. No, we don't understand this, and this is your incarnator, and they're not going to understand this, or change it. I'm like, this is how we speak in Dominica. You say, do you want it to be globally recognized, or do you just want to limit it to the village? No, I don't. But I would like for my community to receive that work, and for others to know about me, as you say.
I think part of that conversation, not being there and not being like, I think this idea around success is really, something that needs to be like picked apart a little bit, because when you do like go to publishers, or if I go to an exhibition, to a gallery, they're like, oh, you want to tour this exhibition? I'm like, no, I'm actually making this exhibition for this local community. I don't want my show to travel to other spaces, because you lose context in some of those things. And so you can publish something globally, and you can publish something and then have it distributed through Amazon. The world is a very small place now, but it doesn't mean that everybody should understand it. And if you try, there's no way to make everybody understand it unless you write it like in French and German and like like if you write it in every single, like there's this idea that English, or our understanding of English, is universal, and that it's also like it feeds into capitalism, and capitalism being success. People won't buy a thing if they don't understand it. But it isn't about commercial success. It's about creating something that resonates with folks.
But for me, if people are not lazy, to use of the word, then they can dissect the work. Like Kristopher projected a story, and I read it last year, and I read it again this week. And the amount of information that I got from this story after I dissected, I read, like I've learned so much more. Like you don't want to put everything in front of their face right away, but like how will people learn if you put everything for them? They have to go in and analyze the work, you know, break it down, and then you have more into that, more richness, I find. And then like they bring it down. I think my book was about 40 chapters. They bring it down to 10. Cut. And like I feel it's not right. I like that you're in your story, what you're projecting there, what you just showed us. Like you fight for your words. Like this is words we want to know. And I know you said, why did you not put the meaning? You say you didn't put the meaning of the word. Why not?
It's something that people can Google. It's also, I think when you are writing, there's this really beautiful tension of people being really immersed in it. Like if you think about it as like swimming, and people are submerged, and it's all they see, it's all they feel, it's all they can like hear. And as an Indigenous woman in art spaces, there are a lot of times that I come up against these walls that I'm like, oh shit, I'm not actually supposed to be here. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't be swearing on the recording. Just like, oh no, like, oh, I forgot this is like a colonial space that's supposed to uphold white supremacy. I'm supposed to be dead. Oh, sorry, I forgot about that. Like, it's just that moment where I come up against that, just living. And I sometimes really enjoy, in kind of a little bit of a mean-spirited way, to do the same thing to other people. So like if somebody's like walking along and reading my essay and they're like, oh yeah, I get this because I'm super woke and I'm like, I'm a good person, I'm not racist because I'm reading this like Indigenous woman's writing. And then they hit this word. It's kind of like this actually wasn't for you. And so they jump out, but like the people who are supposed to still be in are in. And so I'm not going to cushion it, right? And it also like signals to other Indigenous readers, right? If I'm like, this is the word, like I would be forcing them out of the story to accommodate like non-Indigenous readers. And so I'm prioritizing my audience in that moment. So
do you think, Franchesca, that this mask will ever come out?
The mask of
as you said, you're supposed to be dead according to them, right? So do you think that it will ever fall out?
I think like my by continuing to make work and speak about artwork and cultural production from like my own perspective and experience, I don't think institutions are savable. I think they're like really deeply flawed. But I also have the ability to move through them in a way that like some other folks don't. So that makes a difference. And if I can do the work, I should. But I don't think these spaces are meant for BIPOC folks. And by occupying them, you're hopefully making some fissures. But it does take a lot of energy. So I don't know how to explain it. It's you constantly come up against these things where you're like, oh, we're talking about, again, the difference between decolonization and indigenization. So these are colonial spaces. These are spaces for writing histories that are about empire. These are spaces for writing histories for nationalist narratives and myth building. And by me participating in them, they're like, look, we have an Indian. And so if I'm not actively pushing, and if I'm not pushing my own agenda, I'm doing more harm by being in them than not. And so it's a lot of responsibility, but rather than like trying to break down the colonial aspects of them, but rather focus on how can I bring my community and my own way of thinking to the systems that exist in them. So maybe it's searching for Black editors, or searching for publications or publishers that focus on more difficult, it's not difficult, like that's the worst part, it's not. Publishers that have a mandate or a strategy for, and who are known for taking the time to work with their writers, like building a relationship where you really trust somebody and they trust you. I feel like that's also the other part, like institutions and spaces. And when I talk about institutions, I'm also talking about like publishers and editors. They need to trust you and believe in you too. It's not that you aren't open to criticism. It's that there are things that are valuable to you that you need to articulate. And being able to parse out what that is and to be in discussion and to take the time to do that. So I think that's really something that I've been learning as I've been making exhibitions, because I have been brought on to projects. So like I've been offered like spaces to do what I want, but the spaces don't trust me. They all shouldn't always, because I definitely have plans, but it'd be so much nicer if they did trust me and they supported me and they understood that like I'm not just being a jerk that's raging about the oil patch because I want to be like, but because it's about the safety of Indigenous women, it's about sustainability and the environment and being reciprocal with the spaces that we occupy, right?
Yes.
It just, and also, no, I'm not going to go into the rage about the oil patch. Okay, pause. Like just understanding and taking the time to discuss with me why something's important, or why I want to put like 14% of our budget to food, right? Like that's culturally specific. And so there aren't just like ways through dialect that you integrate like your own lived experience or culture. There's ways through like just the way that you tell a story. There was no conclusion. I don't talk about the art. There was no conclusion to my essay, and the format is weird with the bubbles and the red text. And so what are different ways? Like maybe you write a sci-fi novel that focuses on food, and there's so many ways that we like communicate or locate ourselves or locate one another in space, and how like you see each other. So like even if it's like these really in-depth details about clothing, right? And choosing like what you spend your time on as something that like carries through. And dialect is definitely like such a great way to do that, and to prioritize your audience and your readers. Yeah, I think like the next time an editor asks like, do you want this to be global? You'd be like, yeah, but I also want like my global audience to find this, because like not everybody who's from the Dominican like live in the Dominican. That's still a global audience. And so defining success, defining audience, and finding people who will support you in that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Burn it all down. Are there any other questions?
Well, I guess I could just sort of jump in here. I guess I have a different perspective on how I approach being culturally specific, I suppose, in my language. And I do want to have that global audience, and especially with what we're doing with Piton Noire, where we're trying to encourage other Dominicans to break into these genres. I think that we just have to find a balance. We have to find a way of explaining what we mean without dumbing down the work. And I don't have an issue with explaining a word from Creole, for example, because it may not be that easy for my reader to be able to Google it and find it, right? It's only in recent times that we've started to, and I'm sure Sharon can correct me here, where we started to actually produce dictionaries for Creole, or, you know, just, it was always an oral language. It was not a language that was ever written down or noted down until very recently. I would say, what, Sharon, maybe last 20 years or so? But it's something that's been spoken by Dominicans for probably hundreds of years, for generations.
More hand down.
Yeah,
So
orally,
not
by oral tradition. Yeah. So for me, it is not that big a deal, I suppose, to provide some sort of a definition or provide a context. I think where I start to have the dissonance is where you might have people questioning the racial, why your character is a minority, for example, or why a particular character is a minority. Or even maybe a particular gender, you know. So I think that's where I kind of draw the line. I'm not as particular in terms of language and explaining dialect. I don't really have an issue with that. But so that's just kind of my take on it. I do try to make the work universal, just so that as many people as possible don't kind of, you know, that they get where I'm coming from, and that they, you know, I am trying to make the work accessible, I guess is the word I'm looking for, to as many people as possible, because I realize not everybody comes from this small island of 72,000 people, and not all of them have grown up as I did with the languages that we speak there. So that's just kind of my take on it.
Yeah, well, I think the contextualization, and yeah, it's about consent, and like, so the way that I write is different than the way that another curator might write. I'm actually like quite conservative compared to my partner. Yeah, I know, right? but I also worked with like another curator, Alex Nalgabo, and she like would define everything, and the labor that goes into it is just like so much. So we had a painting that was a shaking tent ceremony, and we had to she had to explain like what a shaking tent was and like what a mikanak is, which is a turtle, and the story behind the shaking tent, and like essentially like put all of this context into this label and like did not talk about the work. And so it was our writing is so different, but it's also like always within the same space. And so there'll be installations where like Alex's voice is there, and it's this really gentle and generous sharing. And then I'll write a label and I'll be like, "This ain't for you." We've had to like share those spaces and mediate those spaces with our different voices. And I think it's actually really interesting to do that within, like, I guess in this case, it would be the same book, to have like this plurality of like approaches and ways of communicating. That would be, yeah, I think really, really interesting to, and then to like add poetry to the mix, poetry and short stories and prose.
If I can just interject, Fran, if you don't mind, I'm deeply, deeply steeped in the Western European writing style and tradition. I've taught it, I've got it down, it's a thing. One of the joys of writing in science fiction and fantasy is the ability to step away from that and to explore difference and explore that which is not known. So people who read science fiction and fantasy have a higher tolerance for the ambiguity that Western European writing hates and detests and tries to stamp out at all costs. So I think the elements of culture that Dominicans want to include in their writing, I think there's a natural expression that can happen in science fiction and fantasy that might not be possible in other forms of writing. Because if I call it a Creole word versus one that I've invented about an alien civilization, for the reader, it comes down to the same mental energy, the same mental task. And I think one of the things that Western European writing does poorly is allow the reader space for ambiguity. And I think that in your own writing, Franchesca, you mentioned ambiguity and decontextualization and challenging your writer in how, or your reader, sorry, in how they experience your text. And I think that again flows into science fiction and fantasy as well. So I think these things dovetail quite nicely.
Well, the idea of like art as a woke space, or like a like a progressive space. A lot of folks want to live up to that. And so that really does give me leeway to push in a lot of hard ways. And so it's really helpful to identify, to be able to be like, okay, so, and use that as an argument. So to say, what is the purpose of you changing this when like a reader isn't going to know the difference between whether or not it's made up or if it's something that's inherited. I think what Nicole's talking about, which is like justifying why a character should be Black or like why a character should be like a woman, that's deeply concerning for me, because I started curating in 2017, which was after the Canadian 150 celebration. And essentially everyone was like, oh, we need Indigenous artists. And so I would be brought in specifically for that. It actually has become the opposite for me, where whenever I want to curate like a white artist, people are like, why? It's like, I can curate whoever I want. I'm still going to like, you're still getting my perspective on the work, but I can curate whoever the heck I want. So it's become like this weird space where I can't work with craft as much anymore because it becomes, or people get weirded out when I don't work with Indigenous artists. So that's like another weird dynamic that happens where institutions are weird. Did your internet cut out, Nicole?
Yes, I'm sorry about that. Yeah,
no.
it did drop me, and it's going to drop me again. Unfortunately, the area I am in, the Wi-Fi is not very strong, and I can see like I'm going to be gone soon. So, please, feel free to continue. I'm not sure how long we were going to go for, Chris.
I was thinking that we would go for about another 7 minutes.
Okay.
But we haven't heard from Erwin, and I was wondering if he had anything to contribute. Putting you on the spot, Betty.
Okay, well, I'm sitting here listening and I'm just thinking, if you compare writing as we are trying to do now with music as it is, and looking at rap, there is the American version of rap, there is the European version of rap, there is still a minority version from the Caribbean, and they all do the same genre, which is rap, but they do it respective with their own community. They still use their own accents and some of their own phrasings and so on. It's still rap, but it goes global and everybody recognizes it. Now, if we look at another genre of music, which is reggae, early reggae received the same resistance that some of us are receiving in writing now. That some of the terminologies, the accents, the phrasings were not being recognized by the wider community, and there was some resistance to it. But they didn't stop. And they kept pushing. Right now, reggae is world-renowned, worldwide. Everybody recognizes reggae. Calypso, to a certain extent, is facing the same resistance. Although Calypso is not recognized globally, but it is getting there. And if that does Calypso, they do it in their own way. Dominica does Calypso, we still use our own dialect, our own tuning, our own phrasing. So if we look at writing, I think writing should be exactly what we want it to be regardless, because if we keep allowing editors, which were quote unquote trained by white people or trained from societies, they receive training and education to be editors from those communities, then they are automatically going to keep having the same resistance towards things that they think the world will not accept, or they themselves don't accept. So they will keep asking us to change it. But like Miss Spence is doing, she say, no, this is what I want, this is what I mean, and there are people out there that I know will recognize it, and those that don't recognize it, if they are really interested, they will make it their business to recognize it. Google it, ask about it, tell a friend, tell a friend. So I think that most times with the editors, although you were trained to a certain standard, but if you want to adjust to a changing world, then you need to be flexible. So it's not about just asking the writer, do you want your writing to go global? Then you need to change that. Then you need to find from the writer, what are these expressions? So you can, as the editor, can keep pushing it and extend it to other writers and try to push that level of work or that culture of work as an editor, instead of just sticking to a narrow stream of what you think the global community will accept, right? Editors need to try to bring new elements to the global community rather than just trying to shut down writers or what they think is acceptable. So I think we should keep pushing in that aspect.
Yeah, like how do you develop like a rapport or like an ongoing conversation with your editor where like you normalize. I like to eat and have meetings with people. Like we'll have tea and we'll talk about like why something's important to me. And I think one, food is great because like when people are eating, they don't feel like they're being attacked. I also think like it's a really just nice way to show care because I skip my lunches all the time. Yeah, like how do we have these conversations, and how do we push, and how do we ask more of like our editors and the people that we're trusting with our work? I think there's like another thing that you touched on. Oh, I think also thinking about the nuances of our individual experiences. So like, what does it mean to be Dominican and living in Canada? What does it mean to be like away and to come back home? I'm really honest about how I grow up. I talk about being raised by Newfies. I talk about like being really disconnected and then coming back through art. I talk about the vulnerabilities and the ways that I mess up. I'm honest about like being really fair skinned. I've had a lot of sun, so I look a little browner than I normally do. But like, how does that change the way that I move through the world? And so I think that is also, I think that allows for the conversation. We talk about indigeneity as like this giant thing, but like, what is my experience and who am I? And how do I talk to you from my voice and like my life, and how am I accountable to you too? So if I do something weird, like with teepees or something, other artists can be like, hey, that thing that you did wasn't cool, right? So yeah, how do we also create like a plurality around our individual experiences without legitimizing certain folks or delegitimizing folks? So this idea of like an authentic experience, like an authentic indigenous person who like grew up on the reds, right? My experience is just as real as an indigenous experience, as an Anishinaabe woman's experience. And sometimes it just takes a little bit of time to like have that like security and that knowing. And art and artistic expression is just a really wonderful way to do that too. To find out who you are and to feel good about who you are too. Mm-hmm. That was a problem for me.
I feel good about who you are, Fran.
Not when I have a bunch of stuff in your garage.
Yeah, well, that's my stuff now. You can come and get it whenever you want, but it's mine. So I think that's a good place to stop. I think I'll just ask everyone for some quick final reflections before we sign off. So I think we're going to go clockwise around my screen. So Sharon, you're next. Do you have any final thoughts?
No, just the only thing that I will have to learn to say no, a little bit more, no.
Nicole?
Well, first, Fran, I want to thank you so much for being here and for sharing your experience. And I'm sure that we have all have really benefited from, you know, hearing your perspective and your experience. And I think, like Sharon says, we all have to sort of take back our agency when it comes to our work. And I just want to thank you for helping us to see that probably even more clearly, you know, and so thank you for being here, and it's wonderful to finally meet you.
Erwin.
The opportunity. I appreciate what was shared here today, and it feels good knowing that others share the same opinion, same thought as myself when it comes to matters like this. So once again, thanks to everybody, thanks to Piton Noire, and thanks to Mr. Spence for sharing such wonderful information and experience. Thanks.
Okay, and before I give the final word to Fran, I did want to apologize for my faux pas at the beginning, Fran. I knew what you were doing, but the teacher in me had to take control, and it was too strong, and I apologize. I knew I was doing it wrong when I did it, but I just couldn't help it. So I really appreciate that you came and that you were able to share your perspective, and the way that you shared your perspective was valued by everyone, and I recognize that. So I'm going to leave the final word to you, Fran.
I will open it one more time. I do see Roy's like the yellow thing keeps going around his thing for like a quick half second. No, okay, I will stop holding up faith. If you would like to write an email to me afterwards, I would really appreciate your perspective. And thank you everybody for listening and participating and engaging and spending your Saturday here when there's like a really cool festival going on. I'm also just very excited to meet you. Chris is very excited about this project and I hear about it a lot. So it's nice to put faces and to follow what's going on. So I'm really looking forward to reading more from you guys. And yeah, thank you so much. And if you ever want me to swing by again, this was a really lovely conversation, and I'm always down for lighting things on fire. Anyways, thanks so much.
Welcome. Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you very much.